particular presentation took shape, I realized it would probably look a little different from past research presentations I've given, primarily because this year has not been like other years I've at least experienced as a public historian and researcher. I know I'm really preaching to the choir when I speak to this moment's present challenges to doing our work and telling truth to power. My postdoctoral fellowship's relationship with the National Park Service being terminated during Women's History Month of this year prompted me to reflect on and ground myself in why I felt called to do this work in the first place. And part of why I've always been so drawn to history was because of being motivated to look for precedent and insight from past struggles for justice in order to inform how to resist censorship and bigotry today. As we all are, I'm drawn to women's history for reminders, for inspiration, and for examples of integrity. And that brings us to today's subject. This presentation's title is The Art of Noncompliance, and that has a very intentional double meaning because I'll be talking about how the photographer Hansel Mieth and the photo editor's assistant Peggy Matsui and their careers at Life subverted prejudice and resisted injustice through tactical, deliberate noncompliance. Both women's lives and legacies, I think, provide so much insight into ways to weather today's prevailing climate of sexism, xenophobia, racism, and chauvinism. Because photojournalism was and is so inextricably intertwined with the politics of representation and the art of emotional and evocative storytelling, I think Life's history has a great deal to offer to cultural heritage workers. So, first and foremost, what was novel about Life? The New York City-based publication distinguished itself from its competitors by emphasizing photojournalism as opposed to text-based news stories. Photographs drove their stories forward. And the covers featured here show technological innovations, famous political figures, say hello to Eleanor Roosevelt, entertainers, and just scenes from daily life. Life was unique for blending coverage of high-profile events like Hitler's invasion of Austria with human interest stories drawn from across the globe. The founder, Henry Luce, launched the magazine in 1936. And when asked about the magazine's philosophy, he declared, quote, "Well, if I have to put that in a word, I'd say that my association and I believe in one thing. We believe that human life has a purpose, and our job is to show individual people and nations working out that purpose in freedom and toward justice for all." End quote. You can probably tell from this mission statement that Life generally had a kind of liberal bent, and that won the publication both proponents and detractors. One particularly memorable and vitriolic letter to the editor was written by Charles Loeb, the self-professed Assistant General of the American Patriotic Militia of Los Angeles. And his letter stated, quote, "Sirs, your Jew, Bolshevist, Negro publication is a liar and should be burned to the ground for that article on patriotic organizations. I am starting a boycott of you." End quote. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And Loeb's boycott did not have a measurable impact on Life's sales. Life's most famous female photographer was Margaret Burke White, who is pictured here on the left. She was Life's first female photographer on staff, and in fact, she was one of the 4 original journalists hired by Luce. She took the picture that was featured on the very first issue in 1936. The photograph on the right here is one of her most famous pictures, and it is I think probably my favorite of hers. It is, I think, really a masterpiece in juxtaposition and obviously irony, as a breadline forms in front of a wall featuring a mural with text reading, "World's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way." The photograph conveys so much about how propaganda so often directly contradicts the evidence of our own eyes. Hansel Mieth is considerably less famous today than Margaret Burke White. She was born Johanna Mieth on April 9th, 1909, in a small town in rural Germany. The family often struggled to make ends meet, and when a scourge of sickness swept through their town, Hansel's younger sister, Maria, fell ill. Because of the family's poverty, Maria received substandard medical care and died. In the aftermath of that trauma, Meath decided that she wanted to become a doctor. She received excellent grades in school, but was discouraged from pursuing that ambition, as her teacher told her that people like her didn't achieve higher education. Meath met her future husband, Otto Hagel, when they were both teenagers. And like Meath, Otto was a rebel. He refused to learn how to wield a gun as part of the Hitler Youth and was subsequently beaten by his enthusiastically fascist peers. As teenagers, they left their little town together to ride the rails across Europe. And because, obviously, being a teenage girl, riding the rails was dangerous, Meath wore men's clothing and posed as Otto's younger brother, and he nicknamed her Hansel, and the nickname stuck. Otto immigrated to the US in 1928, before Hansel did and without documentation. She stayed behind, working 12-hour days in a textile factory. 2 years later, he sent her a message telling her to come to San Francisco, which she did after an extremely arduous car journey in which her car slowly broke down between New York City and San Francisco. The couple struggled to make ends meet, initially working as migrant farm laborers. The working conditions they encountered were inhumane. Overseers regularly used whips to keep workers on task, particularly switching their necks and hands. And these conditions became more unendurable after they had a child, Maria, named after Hansel's deceased sister. Hansel and Otto both felt compelled to document the treatment they and their fellow workers were subject to. So they brought cameras to the fields and attempted to surreptitiously take photographs when foremen weren't looking. And this work ended in tragedy during the height of the Great Depression. In 1933, the foreman for the field Otto and Hansel were working in ran their daughter down in his truck, killing her.
Oh,
He was driving drunk and claimed the incident was an accident, but Meath suspected long after that it was a targeted act of retribution to punish the couple for taking pictures to document the conditions they were working in. When law enforcement showed up on the scene, instead of questioning the foreman, they began questioning Otto about his immigration status,
mm.
raising concerns about the possibility for his deportation back to Nazi Germany. So instead of pursuing legal justice, the couple fled. Meath struggled to pick up her camera again, blaming photography for her daughter's death. Still, the drive to document social conditions and show empathy for those struggling motivated her to begin taking pictures again. And this photograph was taken during a longshoreman strike in 1934 and shows strikers forcing their way into a building in search of food. I think it's really interesting to compare this photograph to the picture taken by Margaret Burke White. I think Burke White's photograph feels very carefully composed and deliberate, while Meath's picture feels more immediate and urgent. And I personally hypothesize that that's in part because Burke White saw herself more as an outsider, photographing action, while Meath identified directly with the subjects she was depicting. While Meath was working those 12-hour days in a German factory, Peggy Matsui here was wrapping up a very promising high school career and preparing for admission into the prestigious Wellesley College. Peggy grew up in White Plains, New York, in a house designed by her father, Yasuo Matsui, a first-generation Japanese immigrant architect. Despite differences in geography, socioeconomic class, and racial background, Meath and Matsui definitely had a lot in common. For example, Peggy said in her high school yearbook that her life ambition was to be wild, which seems a very Hansel Mieth thing to say. Peggy entered Wellesley in 1929, shortly before the stock market crash. Photography's power as a medium in terms of race and representation is reflected in a story that Peggy's future husband and also a life photographer, John Phillips, remembered her telling about her college days. According to Peggy, a college counselor who was taking a promotional photograph for Wellesley requested that Peggy pose in her national costume. And when Peggy showed up to be photographed wearing shorts and a pair of sneakers, the photographer was extremely annoyed that Peggy wasn't wearing a kimono. Peggy was an American and, to the best of my knowledge, never visited Japan. Her quote unquote national costume was that of an American teenager. I appreciate this story because it suggests the quiet power of simply subverting people's expectations. It is very much implied that Peggy fully knew that the photographer was subtly asking her to wear traditional Japanese garb, and she still showed up as her authentic self, as she wanted to present herself to the world. And according to John's recollections, Peggy didn't seem troubled or angered by the memory because showing up as herself was enough resistance to satisfy her. Matsui started work at Life around 1939. She worked for Wilson Hicks, pictured here, who was Life's photo editor. She was initially hired to be Hicks's assistant, but at least according to Peggy's future husband, Hicks had Peggy sidetracked to be his secretary instead. John felt certain that he knew why Hicks disliked Peggy so much. In John's words, quote, "She cheerfully handled the photographers and became their lifeline to the magazine. They all liked her. This annoyed Hicks, who knew that he was unpopular with his photographers and didn't care. The reason was simple. He never stood up for them." End quote. Hicks was inclined to be a yes man in response to Life's managing editor, and he apparently wanted an equally agreeable, opinionless person as his direct subordinate. John's description of Peggy's employment situation may be revealing. Quote, "Hicks had tried in vain to get rid of Peggy and replace her with a more compliant secretary." End quote. It's hard to know what exactly Peggy did that struck Hicks as being non-compliant, and it is hard to know what kind of compliance Hicks requested. Hansel Mieth and Peggy Matsui became colleagues during these years at Life. Hansel commented that there wasn't a lot of chumminess between her and Margaret Burke White as the first two female photographers at Life, but Mieth may have felt more immediate solidarity with Matsui. Both women were categorized as outsiders, even in a workplace that professed to be bohemian and progressive. As far as I know, Matsui was the only person of Asian ancestry working in the photography department. And Mieth's background as a factory worker and migrant farmer set her apart from her colleagues. Mieth was repeatedly frustrated by Life's tendency to interfere with the integrity of the photographs she took, especially when she was documenting issues that were deemed controversial by the magazine's editorship. For example, she was tasked with shooting a photo story about birth control clinics. The photograph pictured on this slide was published by Life, and it shows two white women in a clean and business-like clinic. However, when Meeth traveled to a place in the South Carolina Lowcountry that was then known colloquially as Hellhole Swamp to photograph a remote rural clinic that primarily served Black patients, she was horrified by how Hicks's photo department treated her work. It framed the story more as a statistical analysis showing what a great job the state government was doing than a story about real women's efforts to ensure other women received safe health care. At the time, Meeth wrote, quote, "They are cutting the heart out of everything I do. I'm sick of it. I am sick of the whole damned job. Those people in Hellhole Swamp are real people, and I had promised that I would stand up for them. And now this. Now I'm nothing but white shit to them." End quote. John Phillips noted that Matsui stood up for photographers when Hicks wouldn't, which begs the question if Peggy allied with Meeth here. And to me, it seems quite likely. I have an email out to the archive that holds Meeth's papers, and I'm hoping to find internal memoranda that might confirm that. Meeth's working class roots and Matsui's familial ties to a Japanese immigrant put them both in precarious positions in their workplace. Life professed to be liberal and liberated, but both of their careers there illustrate how thin that veneer of progressiveness truly was. Because any allusions to that effect were shattered by Japan's bombing of Pearl Harbor, which sanctioned an era of explicit, state-sanctioned racism at Life. Hicks seized this moment to declare that the optics of having a person of Japanese descent working in his office was unacceptable and unpatriotic. He tried to get Peggy removed from his office and demoted to a more menial position. Rather than accept such treatment, she resigned, and tragically she died shortly thereafter of septicemia at the age of 29. Almost exactly 50 years later, Meeth still remembered Hicks's actions. In her words, quote, "Hicks did some terrible stuff. When war was declared, he said his assistant, Peggy Matsui, could not work any longer in the picture department because she was half Japanese. Hicks knew she was absolutely loyal, to the point where she would have given her life for everybody there. That he could fire her a few days after the war started was awful." End quote. I suspect that it was memories of Peggy that motivated Meeth's desire to call out anti-Japanese bigotry within Life's pages. Because approximately 6 months after Matsui's death, Meeth and Hagel were sent by Life to photograph Heart Mountain in Wyoming, where 10,767 Nikkei people were incarcerated during the war. Their assignment had been approved by the War Department, although the logistics were tricky. Meeth had then been naturalized as an American, but Otto was still a German citizen, and the couple lived in fear that he would be deported and forced into Nazi military service. However, despite that fear, they arrived during a frigid January and began to photograph. Meeth's pictures show people striving to replicate a sense of normalcy under intense surveillance. Detainees were still attending school, holding social events, and creating a sense of community structure and solidarity. Meeth later remembered, quote, "My heart bled for the poor people made to endure those Arctic conditions just because they were decreed enemies and dangerous." End quote. She noted how remarkable it was to both her and to Otto that despite being placed in impossible conditions, inmates were determined to keep their lives moving forward. She focused on showing families, as she was especially horrified by how parents were struggling to keep their children safe in the freezing cold. Most of the incarcerees had come from the warm West Coast and hadn't ever been equipped with clothes that were appropriate for winter. Meath remembered seeing little kids who were, in her words, bundled up like mummies because their mothers were so afraid of frostbite, which was a pernicious problem throughout the camp. Meath also focused on showing normal moments of joy and artistry, like this photograph of men playing Go and they're in a social hall and a woman practicing her bonsai skills. She hoped that these photographs would humanize the experience currently being underwent by detainees, as she observed that too many Americans were perhaps horrified by the incarceration initiated by Executive Order 1066, but were unlikely to speak up due to a prevailing concern that standing up for justice would be perceived as quote unquote un-American. This was probably the most famous of the pictures Meath took at Heart Mountain, and she remembered taking this picture later. Quote, "How could people whose liberties had just been taken away salute the flag? This same flag was the symbol of liberty. What could they have done? What would I have done in a similar situation? I felt extremely uncomfortable. I wanted to escape the situation. Someone nudged me and said, 'It is a requirement that students salute the flag every day in a public school.' I could not ask the students how they felt about saluting the American flag. So I just shot the picture." End quote. Ultimately, Henry Luce and Wilson Hicks did not print any of the photographs Meath took at Heart Mountain. Meath attributed this editorial decision to Hicks not getting what he expected from the pictures, and them not aligning with the wartime propaganda Life was eager to sell. When the photographs were finally published over 50 years later, Meath stated simply, quote, "When I look at these pictures now, I feel they are a group of pictures that speak for themselves. And my understanding and love go out to those people who were interned there." End quote. Meath stated of the Heart Mountain photographs, quote, "When I looked at the group of pictures, I couldn't believe this could happen in America. It just couldn't happen here. I was really scared all the way through the shooting." End quote. And alas, as we know, it is happening here right now. And this brings me to my concluding reflections about how these histories can be tools, models, and inspiration for us as women's history specialists and cultural heritage professionals today. First, I am so moved and motivated by Hansel Mieth's refusal to comply in advance. It seems apparent that she knew Hicks wasn't going to publish those pictures from Heart Mountain because she knew full well what the culture of the magazine was at that time. She knew that Wilson Hicks was bigoted, but she took the pictures she felt moved to take anyway. And she did it while being scared, according to her, and not in spite of being scared. Second, choose your own self-respect. Because part of what I find so profoundly moving about Peggy Matsui's life and career is that she refused to be misrepresented and demeaned. The power of showing up as yourself, especially when authenticity contradicts what people or society may expect of you, has so much power. When Peggy's father, Yasuo Matsui, was imprisoned on Governor's Island as a suspected quote unquote enemy alien, she never hid her relationship to him, but instead visited on Governor's Island every available visitor's day until her death. Despite her own workplace telling her that she should be ashamed of her ancestry, she refused to disconnect or to show shame. And I think there's so much to learn from that these days. Third, an action not having the desired outcome is in no way a failure. It is a delay, but not an ending. And I struggled with this quite a bit when my fellowship's connection with the Park Service drew to a close. It was difficult to not feel like the energy I'd put in was a waste of time or that the projects I'd worked on were failures because they wouldn't appear in the venue I'd expected them to appear in. However, in light of Hansel Mieth's courage and fortitude, I now prefer to think of this delay as just the project biding its time for the right moment. Fourth and finally, I will note that Hansel Meeth's own career with life came to an end when she and Otto refused to testify for the House Un-American Activities Committee regarding their connections with suspect, potentially communist labor activists. In Meeth's own words, quote, "I told them to go to hell," end quote. May we all have the courage of our convictions in this upcoming year, and happy 2026. And that concludes my presentation.